Hello, hello. So today I'm coming to you from the super secret testing closet, and we are actually going to talk a little bit about Louise Gluck's her set of poems from the Wild Iris. I have a couple of them that I want to go over with you guys, and the one that we're going to talk about first is actually the first poem that's titled Matins, the one where the first line is "The sun shines by the mailbox." So if you want to go ahead and find that in your book, we will go ahead and start talking about the text marking for that. All right, so as a quick reminder, we start out with our title, which is Matins. And as a reminder, like I just said, this means morning prayer, or this is another word for morning prayer. And so this is the first one in this cycle. There are actually a couple different Matins poems, but this is the first one that we encounter in our selection. So as we're looking, we know that as we read through, we know our speaker is our poet Gardner, since this is one of the ones where she is directly it's not named after like the names of the flowers or anything like that, so we know that this is who our speaker is. And usually our audience is going to be, when we have the speaker as the poet Gardner, the audience usually is actually going to be the god, uppercase, lowercase, the deity. In this case, I don't know if that is what we're looking at, so we're going to leave the audience here as kind of open. Because there doesn't seem to be a stated audience like there is in a lot of the other poems, the other Matins or Vespers poems. So we're going to say no stated audience. What we see, again, as we see in a lot of Louise Gluck's poems, there is not a lot of structure that happens. We don't have a regular rhythm. We don't have a regular rhyme scheme. We don't even really have stanzas. We do have some kind of indentations right here, which we'll come back to. We start with 3, we go to 6 lines, and then we have another 6 lines here. So that's about as regular a structure as we have. So let's talk about the actual content of this poem. Let's start with our first 3 lines. Yeah. So it talks about the sun shines by the mailbox, leaves of the divided birch tree, folded, pleated like fins, underneath hollow stems of the white daffodils. So we have this imagery. And quite literally, the imagery is describing, a sunshiny day, leaves by a mailbox, and leaves specifically of the divided birch tree. This is going to become important because that birch tree kind of becomes a central figure in this poem. So keep in mind that she calls it divided from the beginning. Underneath that, we have the white daffodils. These words right here, ice wings, cantatrice, and then the dark leaves of the wild violet. But those 2 words specifically are like types of daffodils. So we have that initial imagery of course, our flowers and our tree. As we move on, it talks about the poet seems to be kind of referring to another character, another person, this Noah figure. In Louise Gluck's actual life, Noah is her son. Um, and so we can maybe say that this is the poet's child. It's certainly a possibility. That is not foreclosed to us. So Noah says depressives hate the spring and balance between the inner and outer world. And so what we see right here is this idea of contrast being established. It's actually kind of established up here with this like white and dark and everything like that. But we start to see this idea of contrast here, where we have this other character, this Noah character, like saying like, oh, depressives hate the spring. And our poet says, I make another case, being depressed, yes, but in a sense, passionately attached to the living tree. My body actually curled in the split trunk, almost at peace. And so what we see here is this difference of opinion in how the outer world is actually perceived. And perceived, it seems to be this idea like the depressives hate spring, being depressed, yes. Our poet seems to be this depressive or this person who is depressed. And so Noah is talking about that. And she here is talking about herself. And we have kind of this reductionist view, right? Depressives hate the spring. This is like an absolute, right? That like, oh, her son says no. Depressive people or depressed people don't like to encounter the spring because, it's bright and sunshiny. And so there is that imbalance between the inner and outer worlds. And so we see the poet saying, well, maybe not. Like she says, yeah, being depressed, yes, but also attached to the living tree, her body curled in the split trunk, almost at peace, right? So she's describing a different way of kind of encountering and experiencing the world around her. Um, this outside person says, oh, nope, you got to hate the spring because of who you are and how you feel. And she says, well, maybe not, right? Like I feel attached to the tree. Um, and so we go back to this idea of like the split trunk. And then she describes again in the evening rain, almost able to feel sap frothing and rising. And so we have again this imagery um, throughout, really, of the tree and its life and its growth, right? The sap is frothing and rising. We go back to this other character, right? Noah says this is an error of depressives, identifying with the tree, whereas the happy heart wanders the garden like a falling leaf, a figure for the part, not the whole. Um, and so what we seem to see here is like the poem ending with what like Noah says. Um, and ending with him kind of like reducing this experience, right? Like, oh, you identify with the tree, which is kind of an oversimplification. She's not really identifying with the tree. She talks about her experience with the tree, like she is attached to the tree. And Noah says, like, oh, that's an error, right? If you were truly happy, if you had a happy heart, you would wander the garden like a falling leaf, which is interesting because when a leaf is falling, that usually means that it's detached, that it's dying. And so he says like, oh, you would be identifying with the part, not the whole, right? You would see yourself as like a part of nature and not everything all at once. So what we see here more than anything else, again, I'm going to write it again, is this idea of contrast, right? Because we have the outer and the inner. We have basically what people are like telling her about her own experience, right? This is how you should feel. And her going, well, this is how I do feel. And going back to our last line, we have this idea of like part or whole. We have this idea that we got right at the very beginning about like the light or the whiteness of the daffodils versus the darkness of the leaves. And we also have this idea of like movement, right? Like wandering the garden, and also this idea of stillness, right? Where she talks about how she is like curled in the split trunk. It's interesting too that this tree itself is described so many times as like divided and split. And that is kind of that contrast that we see happening. And so, what we have here more than anything else, especially since this is our initial poem, is this reflection on like how our speaker is choosing to like see or experience the outside world or the natural world. So that is our introduction to kind of to these Matins poems. This is an interesting one, and it really kind of establishes for us like how the speaker relates to the world around her and the natural world, and how she feels this idea about how she is like passionately attached to it, right? How she feels peace there, no matter what other people are trying to say to her, no matter what other people are trying to get her to think or feel, she understands how she thinks and feels. And so this is where we're going to leave our text marking for this.